I think that's one of the things that the pandemic taught us too. I had two employees who had young children and were going to school. And when I said, you guys got to work from home, I was like, I don't care when you do your work. If you have to teach your kids during the day and you have the evening to work, so be it. Work in the evening, get your stuff done in the evening. If you can get it done, whatever, in 2 hours, get it done in 2 or 3 hours, whatever. And I think that, that's a perfect thing to use as an example. The traditional 8 to 4:30 jobs, I might be able to get my work done in a couple of hours because I'm super productive at home, or I'm at a coffee shop, wherever you're doing your work. Everybody's pushing to get back to the workplace, come back to the brick and mortar. And I don't know if that's, I think in part people have to, you can't do nursing from not being at the bedside, but does every job have to be?
All right, everybody. Welcome back to a brand new episode of the HR Heroes podcast. I'm incredibly excited for us to be here today because we have an amazing guest. We're going to be talking about so many challenges when it comes to the world of work, how we're positioning it in our lives today, some of the socioeconomic challenges that new generations are facing, the differences in previous generations, and just the landscape of work today. Linda, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Keenan.
Oh my gosh, I'm excited. To kind of get us kicked off here, I want to kind of ask you a little bit of a deeper question. Yeah. So Linda, how is your heart doing today?
It's just lovely. It's actually raining here in Minnesota right now. So it's been raining for 3 days. I feel like we're in Seattle.
I actually grew up in the Seattle area. And so one thing that I'll never do is move back there because of all that rain. But last time we talked, you were talking about it getting warmer in Minnesota, and you were talking about that being your last sweater weather. But I see that you're wearing a sweater here today. So it seems like today's a good day to be able to do that.
Exactly.
So Linda, I want to be able to ask you a question that came from our previous guest. Now, this individual wants to know, with all the things that we see across the changing landscape of HR and how challenging the work can be for so many people, they want to know, what is your why? And why do you still stay in this profession?
Oh my gosh, that's a really good question. I think from the perspective, I've been in HR a long time. And I think my why would really be, I think in HR, we have opportunity to impact people, their lives every day. And there's always something new. There's always something different. You never know what's going to happen. And if you talk to any HR professional, they'll tell you, one day is definitely different from the next because you're dealing with people, and there's always gray area when you're dealing with people. And I think to be able to work in that field, and just that one time when you're able to, make a difference for somebody, that's super important for me. And from the perspective of making a difference for an organization, where you can impact a lot of people from a strategic perspective, I think that's huge for me. And it's kind of grown over the years, for sure.
So let's talk about kind of your journey into HR. So I know that in our previous conversation, you kind of talked about an early experience that you had with an airline and kind of how that indoctrinated you, if you will, into the HR space. So why don't you let the audience know about that?
Yeah, so I actually started out in HR by chance. I was going to school to own my own travel agency. Basically, that's what I wanted to do. Thank goodness I did not do that, considering what the world is like now. You can go online. But what I did, the school that I went to, they sent out your resume. And so it was in my early 20s. And they said, the airlines called me and they said, we'd like to bring you in for this benefits coordinator position. And I said, what is benefits? No idea what that was. So, but I got into it. I loved it. I got to, what a better way to start out in HR is in the airlines. You get to fly everywhere. And I got to start an HR department down in Florida, which was pretty cool. So yeah, it's been a long journey, but for me, it's been really rewarding. I've done everything. I've worked in the airline. I've worked for the Walker Art Center here in Minneapolis, which is, people are familiar, the big Spoon Bridge and Cherry. If you see pictures of Minneapolis, you've probably seen that. So I worked there for a while, quite a few years. I worked for the University of Minnesota. I was the HR manager for the Carlson School of Management here at the U. And then I hopped into healthcare. So that's kind of been my journey. And I've worked for an organization for the last 12 years as a HR, started out as a senior HR generalist, and then became an HR director. And by the time I was actually laid off, but I was director for three hospitals. So three of the regional hospitals within our organization. So it's been a journey.
I mean, and so many of those landscapes have changed, right? I mean, the way in which kind of healthcare has changed over the last couple of years, especially coming out of the pandemic. What were some of the biggest challenges you kind of saw in the healthcare space as an HR leader as we were kind of
Wow,
navigating that tough time?
that's a great question. So I think one of the big challenges that we faced was just during the pandemic, everything had to pivot and shift. And we were looking at so many different things in the fact that, we were dealing with masking. First of all, everybody was making cloth masks for us. And then um, we had staff who had health issues who couldn't work through the pandemic. So then we had, we were starting to have shortages with staff. We had to send non-essential staff to work from home and protect the staff that we did have on site. So that was super challenging. But I think the organization I worked for was really successful in that aspect. I think kind of, I say post pandemic, I know we're still dealing with COVID, but I think post pandemic, it was really the hiring and the sourcing for positions for nursing and support staff. But we had nurses that were, surgical nurses. We had to cancel surgeries that were non-essential surgeries. And so where do we put them? And I think the unions were really at that point really cooperating with us because I dealt with a lot of nursing unions and other unions, and everybody was just kind of in it together. Um, but the hiring piece, I think, is probably the most challenging thing to come out of this because you had nurses that were retiring or nearing retirement, and the pandemic hit, and they're like, done. You had other nurses who or staff who actually went to remote positions instead of being at the bedside just because of the safety factor of it, and they were not able to work in the hospitals. So I know the hospitals, we really struggled to find staff.
What do you think about the next generation of nurses who kind of experienced the pandemic looking through the glass door, if you will, at hospitals, how nurses were treated, I would say, consistency and inconsistency of the work? What do you think about this next generation? What do you think about kind of their intuition or their perception of healthcare now?
I think you nurses looked at it, and I'm not a nurse, so I only go by what, having conversations with them and talking with people up front. But I think that new nurses coming into the field are looking at it like you saw the worst of the worst, I think, from if you were in, it was bad in Minnesota, obviously. You were in New York or Florida or any of those other places where you were hit, and we saw it every day. And it wasn't just, I'm a nurse and I'm going to go in and care for sick people. It's a nurse. I'm a nurse. I'm going to go in there and I'm going to put my own life at risk.
Yeah.
And I think that for a new nurse coming in, I think it takes something really special to actually say, I'm going to do this. I think you have to have a passion coming into that field. I think too, it's important for newer nurses to talk to more current nurses or nurses who are still in the fields. If somebody's considering going into nursing, to be able to have that connection with somebody that's in it already, to say, we survived it. I mean, so many people survived the pandemic in that field. And it's huge. It's admirable to oh my gosh, the hours, and to watch people die all the time. It was wild. And I was only on the kind of the periphery of it being in HR. It was a unique position to be in. But it's heart wrenching to watch staff kind of go through that roller coaster of fear and emotion. And I think it's also too, what are we looking at as far as mental health? Even how is that going to impact people going forward, and how is that impacting staff now? And so I think it's a big concern of mine.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to think about. I mean, the way in which we kind of think about work in our personal lives has completely changed because
Yeah.
before the pandemic, it seemed like people were living to work. I grew up in the Detroit area, and so I saw people who work for the manufacturers, Ford, Chevrolet, all those companies like GM, and
Or
it seemed like they were living to work in these locations because they felt protected, they felt taken care of, and it was just a way of life. But on the other side of the pandemic, it seems like this new generation, everybody who's working on the other side of the pandemic, if it's silent generation, Generation X, boomers, millennials, Gen Z, alpha, whoever it is, positions work a little bit differently. Now it seems like we are working to live. What do you think about that pandemic or that shift, I guess, in mindset and how we position work in our lives?
I think the pandemic caused everybody to look and say, there's a lot more to life than just going to work every day. And I think the younger generation coming in is really looking at that and saying, I don't want to be my grandparents where I'm coming in, I'm grinding for 40 hours a week. I come home, I'm not happy. I'm literally work, working to live, as you said. And I think the younger generation coming in and I'm going to say this and probably get smacked by the Gen Xers and whatever, but I think they're smarter in that aspect because I think it's important. We had in the pandemic, we realized that, you know what, I might not be here tomorrow. And I think it's a real shift in the mindset of people. I think people are looking at it saying, okay, I want to live every day. I want to take the trips that I, want to take the trips. I want to go to the ocean. I want to jump out of a plane. I want to do things that I've never done before because I might not be here tomorrow. And I think we had a real reality check with life and death for a good 2 years. Um, and I think that the younger generation coming in is really looking at that and saying, and as HR, what do we need to know? What do we need to be preparing for or be prepared for people coming into the workforce? Because we're facing a whole different thing. We've never lived this, these generations have never lived through an actual pandemic. And how do we brace ourselves for what's coming? And I think the values are changed. It's not our grandparents. It's not, even our parents for that matter. I have a daughter who's in her 20s and I hear her talking and very different when I was a kid and growing up. I'm going to go out into the workforce. Very different mentality. So, yeah.
I mean, it's really tough because I think about me being born in 1990. We talked about this in our previous
Yeah.
conversation. You know, some of the things that I've experienced in my lifetime was 9/11 when I was 11 years old, the Great Recession in 2008. We've seen wars in Afghanistan. We've seen all these different things. Now we've seen a pandemic. And it seems like we've had these experiences in life that have kind of helped us refocus on the important things. And I feel like being present is something that a lot more people are looking for today, especially when it comes to their ability to get the most out of life, because we don't have that sense of, I would say, foundational security in knowing that everything's going to be okay. Does it make sense to kind of think that you could show up and go to work and just be like, oh, well, this is work and this is the role it plays in my life if tomorrow was guaranteed? And I guess kind of we're talking about in this conversation that tomorrow isn't guaranteed. And that's why so many of us are looking at things differently. Have you ever had experiences in your life where you kind of wish you could roll back the clock and be a little bit more free living like this new generation is?
Yeah. I think, I look back at my career and I think, kind of being in a different place now in my career doing consulting. And I look back at it and I think, what was I, sometimes what were you thinking? You're afraid to take PTO. You're afraid, you're not checking your emails at midnight or 11 o'clock or whatever and answering emails. I mean, it's, it's different. We're not going to see that in this generation coming in. They're not going to be checking their emails at midnight and then actually having their boss expect an answer. And I'm not saying that my boss has ever expected an answer, but you just felt this obligation to do that. And I think, looking back on it, I think, would I have changed things? Probably, but then would I have learned what I have? And I think you have to be open minded, especially in in HR, you have to be open minded to change. You have to say, we learned from the pandemic, obviously, that things are not going to stay the same, that you have to be able to pivot. You have to be able to go with, we're not able to hire people. And now it's oddly strange that we're using AI for things and automatic, and applicant tracking systems and those kinds of things. And 20 years ago, no one would have heard of that. But how do you look at those things and say, okay, how can we incorporate those now, into the world and into the world of HR? And I think, would I have seen this coming 20 years ago? Probably not. Like you said, I mean, you're the generation coming, that are in the field right now that were there. My daughter was in kindergarten when 9/11 happened. Your generation has seen more than many generations have in the world, and talk about political unrest and all of the things that are happening in our communities. And particularly, I live in Minnesota. We had the incident with George, the murder of George Floyd, and all of the things that happened in literally 10 minutes, 15 minutes from my house. And so it's kind of, you look at that and you think, oh my gosh, what are we having to face? And then how can people in my career path make an impact or change or pivot or do what we have to do to look at this generation and say, how do we make things different, better? How do we get people in the door? How do we encourage people at this point when the world is, um, you know, I can be an influencer and make a 6-figure salary,
Yeah, you
you
could.
know? And how do we get those people and say, hey, we want you to come in and we want you to make $20 an hour, and, and it's just different. So how do we entice people to come into organizations and actually work? And I think there's a lot of things. So I probably went off on a tangent, but I could talk about
No,
it.
I think it's awesome because one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking there was I think we expect more from our work experience these days, meaning the world in itself is so unpredictable that we're almost looking for work to fill some of those gaps that we have in our lives, meaning psychological safety, being heard, being seen, being validated, all of these things, being around mentors and true leaders who can help us become a better version of ourselves. Seems like work is almost being thrust into a higher place of responsibility, not just for income, not for being able to pay your bills, but for being able to be a safe space, if that makes sense, that we can spend our time 8 hours a day around people who we like, around leaders who we look up to, and get nourishment for our soul and for our overall person, if you will, to be able to kind of show up and be experiencing these places that are more fulfilling than they were in the past, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. I think, working for an organization I have to personally myself have to connect with the mission of an organization to work for them. I can't, I would have a really challenging time working for an organization that I couldn't connect with the mission. Um, I think it's super important for people coming into the workforce, because now, I mean, I think about things like our PTO plans. Are they what we should be doing right now? If I'm a younger person coming in, I know that work can be done remotely. So I can do work from, Hawaii, or I'm just thinking of tropical locations right now, but I can come in and I could work around the world. I could go be working from Italy right now and still do the work that I'm doing. And I think fault my generation, but the generation before mine and Gen X, everybody's pushing to get back to the workplace, come back to the brick and mortar. And I don't know if that's, I think in part people have to, you can't do nursing from not being at the bedside. But does every job have to be, in person? And I think it's the older generations are saying, well, yes, of course, because you have to have that connection. But we also have your generation, Keenan, who is looking at it like, we grew up with technology, and the
Mm-hmm.
generation coming forward, I mean, they're far ahead of you guys, quite honestly. I mean, they're 1 years old with an iPhone, looking at their parents' iPhone. This is the generation that's coming forward. What can you do from technology that we couldn't do before? So we have to be creative in saying, okay, should we be offering more remote work? you know, that will give people a sense of that. I also am concerned too, just because of what you had said and kind of what our country's been through, is that aspect of mental health. And I think we need to be boosting mental health programs where the traditional employee assistance program or EAP may not be enough.
Hmm.
It's great 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, might not be what we need now. And if we do have those programs, mental health for our and having that psychological safety and those pieces in the workforce when you're dealing with mental health issues in the workplace, and we're in a mental health crisis. So what can we as employers provide to employees coming in or still there and having gone through this? I think about somebody like myself, like boosting programs like elder care. I'm taking care of my mom. What are kind of the things that we need to be doing now as an employer to say this is what's important to our employees? And I think we really need to examine that. And it might not be doing the things that we did before. I think we have to shift and look at that and say, what's the expectation? What do we need to do going forward to have people work for us? Do we have, like I said, do we have them work remotely? Do we offer more remote work? Do we offer services? I know I talked with an organization that they were doing teleradiology.
Hmm.
Radiologists from across the country. They're reading readings from, they're out in California, they're reading reports from Minnesota. And it's like that work has boomed even in the last couple of years since the pandemic. What's possible? We have to be creative. We have to think outside the box.
What got us here will not get us there.
Exactly. Oh my gosh, that's a great way to put that.
Yeah, I mean the thing that I think about from a leadership perspective today is we all came from a playbook, if you will, of what business leadership looked like. And we're
Yeah.
still running those same plays. But then we had the pandemic occur and it completely ripped out a huge section of the book and nobody knew what to do. And so now from a leadership perspective, we have to be curious enough to think about what can we do to attract this new generation, to support them, to give them the fulfillment that they're looking for because like you said, the motivations are completely different. Over the last couple of years, we've heard a lot about the idea of work life balance, which is really tough because work and life have been out of balance for us for a long time.
Yeah.
Now I think about the term of work life integration because you're exactly right. With a computer and a laptop, you can work from anywhere today. A perfect example is I have a really close friend who is an accountant for a gaming company here in Las Vegas. During the pandemic, she realized that she wasn't required to go back into the office anymore. So she moved to San Diego. Now, she still lives in San Diego while she still has her residency here because she has a home here and she works remotely. But the organization doesn't recognize that because she is constantly getting her work done. So the question becomes, is she in the wrong for getting her work done and taking advantage of the opportunity that was in front of her? Or is her employee not taking advantage of that type of remote work style? Because I feel like you could attract a lot
Yeah.
more talent by giving people that flexibility to do those type of things. I'm currently in the process right now of working through a little bit of a personal challenge, if you will. My girlfriend, who is graduating from PA school, just got a job offer in Hawaii. So you brought that up, which is really funny. And so we're thinking about moving back there next year so I can work remotely and still do this. But in a world where we came from before, that wouldn't even be a
Mhm.
possibility. And we
No,
have to think outside the box to be able to do that stuff. But the generation of everybody who's working today sits in an interesting pocket of time because if you are creative enough and you take accountability to get your work done, you can really do anything that you really want. And it's such an interesting opportunity for us to be able to take advantage of.
I don't think the traditional 8 to 4:30 job. I think that's one of the things that the pandemic taught us too. I had two employees who had young children and were going to school. And when I said, you guys got to work from home, I was like, I don't care when you do your work. If you have to teach your kids during the day and you have the evening to work, so be it. Work in the evening, get your stuff done in the evening. If you can get it done, whatever, in 2 hours, get it done in 2 or 3 hours, whatever. And I think that, that's a perfect thing to use as an example. The traditional 8 to 4:30 jobs, I might be able to get my work done in a couple of hours because I'm super productive at
Hmm.
home, or, even at a coffee shop, wherever you're doing your work. I mean, I think that, or, if you go to Hawaii, Keenan, you can always be in, on the beach
Yeah,
working. But I think, you're right. I don't think that, I think in 10 years, it's going to look completely different. I think the landscapes, we're talking about the younger generation too. And I'm thinking about things like, what are the benefit things that are valuable to somebody in a younger generation coming in? I don't know, like, and this is going to, like, all my HR friends are going to just probably shoot me. But the concept of a retirement plan, I think there's a sense of, is the world going to be here in 20 years? You know what I mean? And
exactly.
I don't know. Like, are we seeing people that are younger saying, I don't care about retirement? It's hard to think about retirement when you're 22. But now you throw the world in there and you say, look at all the things that are happening in the world. Am I going to have my money? Which, by the way, I need a livable wage. Um, and apartment costs and housing costs are going through the roof. What am I going to prioritize? Am I going to
And
prioritize?
can I retire if my parents can't retire? You
Exactly.
know what I
And,
mean?
and it's like student loans are through the roof. And I know we've had some student loan forgiveness, but there's a lot of people that weren't eligible for that.
Yeah.
So it's like, how do you look at, I got to pay my student loans. I have to do the, I have to have somewhere to live. So I got to live with four people because I can't afford to live by myself. So that's what this generation and, is dealing with, your generation right now. I mean, those are the things that are real and tangible and things that you have to look at and say, these are your if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's right at the bottom. It's like, that's what employers need to consider when we're looking at people coming in. So when we look at programs like, okay, student loan forgiveness, tuition reimbursement, those kinds of things, those plans, do we get creative and say, okay, how am I going to attract people to come in and work for me? We talked about the remote aspect of it. We talked about that, um, tuition reimbursement, those kinds of programs where that's going to mean something to me. If I'm somebody coming in with a huge amount of student debt, what can I, what can we do as employers to say, okay, how can we think of programs that can help that? Or if I want to go back to school I'm 30 years old and I want to go to school and I'm at working somewhere, tuition reimbursement programs are huge. And how can we as employers utilize those programs? I think about PTO and looking at PTO programs. Is a traditional PTO program working? I don't know what's working, if it's working now. You think about holidays from a diversity perspective, like, how many holidays do people celebrate across the world? All different holidays. And I can't tell you how many employers that I've looked at, they're still doing the basic six,
Yep.
for holidays. And it obviously included in PTO, but how are we working with the changing worlds to accommodate all these things with the younger generations coming in and attracting people? It's huge. We got to think out, like I said, outside the box. We got to be creative. It's not the same as it is. We can't, like you said, can't keep operating the way we have and expect the same results.
It's a really interesting model. I was listening, and I would love to get your opinion on this. So, the idea of flexible work, okay, looks completely different in the future. I was listening to a podcast the other day with the CEO of a company called Twilio. So, Twilio is a SMS gateway. They send all the text messages, right, for
Yeah.
businesses. And the CEO was talking about the future of work has to look different from what it looks like now because they currently have four gigantic real estate installments: San Francisco, Seattle, Houston, Texas, and somewhere. I'm just making those places up.
Yeah.
The utilization of those locations is in the low single digit percentiles. Okay. So he's like, nobody wants to come back to the office because we gave them the trust and the freedom to do the work that they need to get done on their terms. Now we say, come back to the office. Nobody wants to come back. Okay. So the future of work from his perspective almost looks like a micro coffee shop. He said, what if your brand had the ability to stand up 1,000 square foot coffee shop in your city So when you're working remotely, you could actually go to that location and you could meet other team members at that space to be able to get that human connection. What do you think about that flexible type of work environment in the future instead of these gigantic monolith like structured buildings that everybody came to?
Yeah, cube farms.
Yeah.
I think Leslie, I think that's a fantastic idea. I think too that like we have places here where they're kind of the work setting where you can go and utilize printers, and I don't know if people actually print things anymore, but you can go and utilize printers and utilize the Wi-Fi, utilize conference rooms. We have places like that here that are not coffee shops, but you can go in and utilize but they're for like a day, or you can have a membership there and you can go there for, however much time. But I think you're right. I mean, I think like my former employer, they had a hotel concept. So so many people were working from home, but if you needed to come in, you could come in and kind of have a place to land. I don't think that's a bad thing. I like the idea of the coffee shop, kind of a coffee shop aspect where you can say we're going to meet people from our team and go there. And, I love that idea. I think, I think that's a fantastic, thought about how can we be creative, if I tell a new hire that, if I tell somebody we're trying to recruit and then they're, 22 years old. I keep using that number, but they're 22 years old and they're coming in. We're trying to recruit somebody. And if I told them that, you can work from anywhere in the country or the world, or we do have these places you can cut the place you can come. It's kind of like a coffee shop. I mean, seriously, I'd be like, sign me up.
Right. You know, I think about like an AT&T store. That's the one that's popping up in the front of my mind. You never see a gigantic AT&T building, but you
Yeah,
see little storefronts. And it would be cool if like brands had those storefronts that you could just pop into. There's
yeah,
other people hanging out. There's a little barista hanging out there as well. Nice chill environment. You can get collaboration done. It would just be a really interesting time to kind of see. But it's cool that we're talking about kind of like the evolution of work. I want to get your 2 cents on what the evolution of HR is going to continue to look like. So we touched on the topic of AI here a little bit. Technology from an AI perspective is on everybody's mind. But often
yeah.
HR leaders and HR individuals are not part of the early adopters, if you will, when it comes to using technology and AI. So what do you think kind of the future of the space looks like with all this technology that's being thrust into our environment?
You know, I think when we talk about HR, we talk about a few things. HR was very transactional. I think those features like the transactional, the payroll, and those kinds of things, that's where technology is going to come into play. I mean, I think, like AI and those pieces, I think that's where that value is going to be, is in those transactional services. I think HR has been for, a few years now, at least, moving more into a strategic aspect, which I think is super important for an organization. Talking about all the things we have so far, you need HR there to help you, look at the culture of your organization, look at your engagement, look at how we're going to bring people into the organization. So that talent acquisition piece, I think those more strategic pieces is the direction that HR needs to go. I think as we look at the transactional pieces, I think that could go easily, I think, to technology. Um, you know, I think AI, I've used it and I think it's, it's remarkable, quite honestly. Like what, when people say you can't, I'd be able to recognize it. No, you can't. I
Right.
couldn't recognize if somebody used AI or not, I don't think you could. And I think, why not utilize that technology that we have available to us? Why not use it versus, being afraid of it? I've always been kind of that early adopter of things. Um, and why can't we? I always say, it's like, why not? Why not use what we have available to us? And I think in HR, it's super important to start training the people that are in those positions, to say, okay, what else can you do? What else can you do? What else should we be focused on? How can we utilize that technology? What part do you have to play if we are going to use that technology? So what is going to be your role in that? I think that succession planning and looking at development, I think development is, and having individual development plans is super important. But um, what are we going to do? What are we going to see? And even 2 years is going to be different. We're already seeing that. How many jobs are going to be eliminated? I don't mean to scare people, but how do you then, as in HR, show your value? And I think it's going to be in that more in that strategic realm, where you're looking really at an organization's culture and engagement and those pieces, and how can we source position? How can we bring people into those positions? I think that's where HR is going to really show their value.
In all of your experience, what was the most fulfilling work you could do as an HR leader?
I think for me, it's working with my leaders to, there's leaders are very different now than they were kind of looking back at leaders I worked with, and I've worked with fantastic leaders throughout my career and supported leaders. But I think leaders in our organizations are looking for more. They're looking for HR to guide them. I think that working with a leader, I'm thinking of one leader in particular that I had, which I thought was fan. She was a really good leader, but very green. And I coached her and I worked with her, and she came in and inherited a team that was, you know, low engagement. I will say that they had really low engagement. They hated their jobs. It wasn't the best, it wasn't the best field to be in. Um, but they just had not a lot of self-worth at that point. And I coached her and talked to her and worked with her employees. And she was able to increase her engagement 45%.
Wow.
And ended up going from a supervisor to a manager and then over, 2 hospitals. And she was phenomenal, but she wanted it, she wanted to be able to do that. I think that to me, that's rewarding. And it's always rewarding when employees come and say, we, thank you so much. Um, I think that is, for me, watching leaders grow like that, though, it's huge to me.
What I didn't hear you say there was answering questions about benefits, doing payroll, being a
No.
paper filer. Do you know what I mean? And so that's the thing that I like to talk about in these conversations is the most fulfilling work that we do is connecting with other people. It's
Yes.
being in the human seat, right? And so when
Yeah.
we think about technology, we have to think about how we can eliminate all those tasks that keep us from doing exactly what you just talked about.
Yeah.
Being able to coach others, being able to lean into people, being able to help them become their best version of themselves. And I feel like that kind of is what the future of HR is going to look like. It's going to be very tactful. It's going to be very strategic. It's going to be very pouring into others instead of all the redundant tasks that we continue to be not fulfilled by. I
Yeah.
just think that that's kind of where we're going to.
No, don't get me wrong though, Keenan. Like, that stuff's important because that's the most important thing for an employee, quite honestly. Am I getting
Yes.
paid? And are my benefits right? And somebody explain them to me, please. So, I mean, those pieces are super important. If you don't get that right, you have no trust. You have zero trust as an HR professional. You can't do the strategic work if you can't get the transactional work right. You just can't. But if you can do that, if you can eliminate the errors and those pieces and that transactional piece, you get my paycheck right. I'm going to trust that you know what you're doing, and I'm using my hands on the table, this you can't see, but I'm going to trust that you're doing this work over here, right? You know what I mean? So I think that building that trust with your organization is huge. And I think HR has to do that. If you can't get those foundational pieces right, it's awfully hard to get people to trust you in HR to be able to do that strategic work.
No, you're 1,000% right. As we kind of land the plane here,
Yeah.
Linda, I want to pose an opportunity for you to ask our next guest a question. What would you like to ask them?
I think one of the things that I was thinking about, when you ask that question to come up with something, and I think, as you consider our changing landscape, and organizations in the world, what advice would you give to someone coming into HR, um, that you feel would be critical for them to consider coming into the field of HR?
It's a beautiful question. Was there something else that you wanted to add there?
Oh, I was just going to say, I've done a lot of mentoring with people, and I think that's been a question that's, been asked of me. So I thought that would be a good question to ask of somebody else. So, yeah.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Linda, for being on the podcast. You are truly the definition of an HR hero, and being able to kind of
Oh,
hear your 2 cents about how the landscape is changing, what's happening in the field of work, the importance of mental health, and honestly, just the whole person view of who we are today, I think has completely changed. And it's so cool to hear leaders like you kind of advocating for what the future of everything looks like for us all. So I just want to say, for everybody watching and listening, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate
thanks,
it.
Keenan. You're awesome.
There we go, guys. That's a wrap.